The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which Jeremiah Chandler had always considered the most forgettable day of the week. And yet that particular Tuesday in the spring of 1882 would mark the beginning of something he could not have foreseen in 1,000 years of riding dusty trails. He had been sitting at the back corner table of Holt's Saloon in Abilene, Kansas, nursing a glass of rye whiskey and watching the ceiling for water stains when old Pete Mackey shuffled in and dropped the yellow envelope on the table without ceremony. Jeremiah read it once, then twice. He folded it carefully, tucked it into the breast pocket of his worn leather vest, finished his whiskey in a single long pull, and set the glass down with a quiet click. The telegram was from a lawyer named Elias Drummond in a town called Cassidy Creek, Colorado. It informed Jeremiah that a woman by the name of Catherine Rourke had settled there some years ago and was now a resident of some standing. The lawyer made no apologies for the brevity of the message and offered no further detail. He simply confirmed that Catherine Rourke was alive and that the address attached would find her. Jeremiah had not spoken Catherine Rourke's name aloud in nearly 4 years. He had not needed to. Her face had been sufficient company enough during the long, lonely rides across the Kansas plains and through the Oklahoma territory. He had carried the memory of her with him the same way a man carries a debt, not bitterly, not heavily, but with a quiet and constant awareness that it was there. 4 years ago, Catherine Rourke had been a frightened young woman of 22 with nothing to her name but a borrowed horse and a brother who had gotten himself shot by the Delacroix gang outside of Dodge City. Jeremiah had been 27 and working loosely as a cattle broker and occasionally as a hired gun for the Santa Fe Railroad, though he preferred not to advertise that second part. He had come upon Catherine crouching behind a boulder on the side of the Cimarron Road, the borrowed horse long gone and her brother bleeding slowly into the red Kansas dust. He had stopped. He had carried her brother to the nearest town. He had paid for the doctor out of his own pocket, which at the time was not a deep pocket, and he had arranged safe passage for both of them on a westbound stage. When Catherine had looked up at him with those dark, storm-gray eyes full of desperate gratitude and said, "I don't know how I'll ever repay you," he had shaken his head and told her not to worry about it. But he had not said it was forgotten. He had never said that. Because the truth was, he had not forgotten it at all. He had thought about it in the way a man thinks about an unfinished thing, not with any calculation or selfishness, but with a simple awareness that the ledger between them was open. And now the ledger had brought him west. He told himself that the favor was the reason. He told himself he simply wanted to know that she was all right, that she had landed somewhere decent. He told himself a great many things on the 2-week ride from Abilene to Cassidy Creek, Colorado, most of which were technically true, and none of which were the whole truth. The whole truth was harder to look at directly, the way you cannot look directly at the sun. Cassidy Creek sat in a wide valley between 2 gentle ridges of pine-covered mountains, the kind of Colorado landscape that made a man feel simultaneously very small and very grateful. The town itself was newer than most, built up in the years following a modest silver strike in 1878 that had drawn a steady wave of settlers, merchants, and opportunists. By 1882, it had the feel of a place that had decided to stay. There was a proper main street with a hardware store, a dry goods emporium, a barber shop, a bank, and a small post office. There was a schoolhouse at the east end with fresh white paint. There was a church with a copper bell that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in bright, generous flashes. Jeremiah rode into town on a gray gelding named Duster just as the afternoon sun was beginning its long, lazy descent toward the western peaks. He was travel-worn and dusty in the way that only 2 weeks of open trail can make a man, his dark hair too long beneath his hat, and a beard he had not planned on his jaw. He looked, he supposed, like exactly what he was, a drifter with a purpose and not much else to show for himself. He asked the man sweeping the steps of the hardware store where he might find a woman named Catherine Rourke. The man stopped sweeping. He looked at Jeremiah with an expression that was not unfriendly but was distinctly measuring. "You know Miss Rourke personally?" he asked. "I do," Jeremiah said. "I have business with her." "What kind of business?" "Personal kind," Jeremiah said, keeping his voice easy. The man considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "She's likely at the mill this time of day. Follow Main Street north until it curves east, then you'll see the sign. Can't miss it." Jeremiah thanked him and rode on, and it was only when he was halfway up the curving northern stretch of Main Street that he saw the sign the man had mentioned, and the sight of it hit him somewhere below the sternum in a way he had not anticipated. It was a proper painted sign, hung above the entrance to a solid, well-built timber structure that sat on the bank of the creek the town was named for. The creek ran bright and quick with snowmelt, and the sound of it was everywhere, musical and clean. The sign read in neat black letters on a white background, ROURKE Flour and Grain Mill, EST, 1879, C. ROURKE Proprietor. He sat on Duster for a long moment and read the sign 3 times. Proprietor. Catherine Rourke had built a mill. He dismounted and tied Duster to the hitching post outside, took his hat off and knocked some of the dust off it against his knee, put it back on and went in. The interior of the mill was exactly what it ought to be, warm and loud with the grinding work of the millstone, thick with the good smell of crushed grain, and busy. There were 2 men in work aprons moving sacks near the loading door, and a third operating the mill mechanism with practiced efficiency. A boy of perhaps 14 was sweeping the spillage from around the base of the stone with a long-handled broom. Everyone moved with the unhurried purposefulness of a well-run operation. And there, at a tall wooden workbench along the far wall, stood Catherine Rourke. She had her back to him. She was leaning over what appeared to be a ledger, her dark hair pinned up at the back of her head in a practical knot, her dress a deep blue that had seen good use. She was writing something, and she finished it before she turned around, which told him a great deal about the woman she had become. When she did turn, she stopped completely. The expression on her face went through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, unmistakably. Recognition. Something that might have been relief, or might have been fear, or might have been something else entirely that she did not allow to settle long enough for him to name it. Then she composed herself, which she did with a speed and naturalness that surprised him, and she crossed the mill floor toward him. She was 26 now. She had been pretty at 22 in the way that a girl is pretty when she is frightened and brave at the same time. She was something different at 26. She had grown into herself in a way that the intervening years had assembled with care. Her gray eyes were clear and direct. Her bearing was composed. She moved through her mill the way a person moves through a space they have built and know entirely. "Jeremiah Chandler," she said. Her voice was steady. She stopped a few feet from him and looked at him fully, the way she might assess a delivery of grain she had ordered and was checking for quality. "Catherine Rourke," he said. "You look terrible," she said. "I've been riding for 2 weeks. That would do it." She paused. "How did you find me?" "Hired a man to look." "Found your lawyer's name in a territorial business registry." Something shifted in her expression, though he could not have said precisely what it was. "You were looking for me." "I was." "Why?" He reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded piece of paper which he held out to her. She took it without breaking eye contact, then glanced down at it. It was a simple note, not the telegram but an older thing, written in his own hand 4 years ago on the back of a receipt from a Dodge City mercantile. It said, "I owe you C. Rourke one favor, terms to be determined at time of collection. J. Chandler." He had meant it as a joke at the time, a light thing to ease her distress. He had pressed it into her hand as the stage was pulling out of Dodge, and she had laughed despite everything. A quick, startled laugh that he had thought about rather too many times in the years since. She looked at the note now, and a slow, complicated smile moved across her face. "You kept a copy," she said. "I did. And you rode 2 weeks to collect." "I did." She looked up at him. The smile was still there, but her eyes were serious. "What is it you want, Jeremiah?" He had thought about this question a great deal on the ride west. He had prepared a dozen sensible answers: a meal, a night's lodging, information about the territory, all technically within the scope of a favor owed. What came out of his mouth was the truth, which surprised him nearly as much as it surprised her. "I don't rightly know," he said. "I think I mostly wanted to see that you were all right." The mill hummed and ground around them. One of the workers called something to another across the room. The boy with the broom paused to watch them with the unabashed interest of 14 years before one of the workers told him to mind his work. Catherine Rourke looked at Jeremiah Chandler for a long moment with those gray eyes that gave away less than they took in, and then she said, "Come to supper tonight. I live on the hill above the north end of town. White house with a green door. 6 o'clock." She handed the note back to him. "And keep that. You haven't collected yet." Then she turned around and went back to her ledger, and the conversation was apparently over. Jeremiah stood in the mill for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before he turned and walked back out into the Colorado afternoon, where Duster was waiting patiently, and the creek was singing over its stones, and the painted sign caught the light and held it. He found a room at the Cassidy Creek Hotel, a modest but clean establishment run by a stout woman named Mrs. Haverson, who told him the rate was 50 cents a night, and that breakfast was included, but supper was not. He paid for 3 nights without knowing why he chose 3. He washed and changed into the better of his 2 shirts, which was not saying much, and he sat on the edge of the narrow hotel bed and watched the light change in the window for a while before it was time to go. The white house with the green door was exactly where she had said it would be, at the crest of a small rise above the north end of town, set back from a picket fence with a vegetable garden that had been planted with considerable thought. There were tall sunflowers along the west side of the fence and a rose bush beside the front steps that looked like it had weathered at least 2 Colorado winters and was the better for it. He knocked. She answered the door herself, which he noted. She had changed from her work dress into something simpler but cleaner, a pale gray that matched her eyes, and her hair was down from its working knot, though not entirely loose, drawn back at the sides and left to fall a little more freely. She looked, for a brief and unguarded moment as she opened the door, very young, and then the composure settled back around her and she stepped aside to let him in. The house was small but remarkable. Not in the way of expensive things, but in the way of a person who had assembled a life out of intention rather than accident. There were books on a shelf beside the fireplace, real books, not just almanacs and farm ledgers, though those were there too. There was a braided rug in warm reds and browns on the plank floor. The table was set for 2 with white crockery, and there was something on the stove that smelled of rosemary and onion, and made his stomach remind him very forcefully that he had eaten nothing since the hard biscuit and salt pork at dawn. "Sit down," she said, moving back toward the stove. "It's lamb stew. One of the ranchers outside of town trades me lamb for flour. It's a fair arrangement." "You negotiated a trade with a rancher," he said, sitting down at the table. "I negotiate trades with half the people in this county," she said, not with any particular pride, just as a statement of fact. "How do you think a mill survives out here? Cash money is scarce, but everyone needs flour." He watched her move around the small kitchen with the same ease she had in the mill, competent and unhurried, and he thought about the girl he had found behind a boulder on the Cimarron Road with nothing but borrowed trouble and borrowed hope, and the distance between that girl and this woman seemed both very large and, oddly, not large at all. She set 2 bowls on the table, and a plate of bread she had clearly baked herself, and a small crock of pale butter, and she sat across from him and they ate for a while in a silence that was not uncomfortable. "Tell me about the mill," he said, because he wanted to hear it in her words. She considered where to begin. "I came to Colorado in the spring of '79, she said. "My brother Thomas recovered well enough from his wound and he went back east to Cincinnati where our mother's family is. He wanted me to come with him. I almost did. She broke a piece of bread and buttered it with care. But I'd been east. I knew what was waiting for me there. A room in someone else's house and a life that would be decided for me by everyone except myself. So you stayed west. I came west, she corrected. I had been in Dodge City, and Dodge City was no place for a woman alone to make anything of herself. Too rough, too transient, too much of everything that eats people up. But I'd met a woman on the stage who told me about Cassidy Creek. She said the silver strike had brought people, but the silver was running thin, and what the town needed now was the things that make a place permanent. A school, a church, a mill. You had money, he asked. I had $43, she said. Which sounds impossible, I know. But I had a plan, and a plan counts for more than people give it credit for. She ate a spoonful of stew. There was a man named Harold Finch who had staked a claim to a stretch of the creek with the intention of building a mill. He got the silver fever halfway through and abandoned the claim to go digging. He sold me the water rights and the half-built frame for $35 and a promise that I'd grind his grain for free for 2 years if he ever came back. Did he come back? He did not. He went to Leadville, and I haven't heard of him since. A brief pause. I hope he's well. He sold me a good deal. How did you finish the building? Slowly, she said, and with considerable help. She set down her spoon. There were men in this town who thought it was amusing, a woman building a mill. There were a few who thought it was impertinent, but there were more who simply saw that a mill was needed and that someone was building one, and decided that the builder's sex was secondary to the practical reality. She looked at him steadily. I paid fair wages to the men who helped me build. I did my own share of the labor. I read every book and pamphlet on millwork I could acquire, including 3 I had sent by post from a library in Denver. I made mistakes. I fixed them. It took 14 months from the day I arrived in Cassidy Creek to the day the mill ground its first batch of grain. Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. 14 months, he said. 14 very long months, she agreed, and something in her voice carried the weight of exactly how long those months had been without softening it with self-pity. And now, he asked. Now the mill employs 3 men full-time and 2 part-time. I service 43 farms and ranches within a 30-mile radius. I expanded the storage capacity last autumn. I'm saving to add a second stone this spring, which will let me process nearly double the volume. She looked at him levelly. I'm not wealthy, but I'm solvent, and I own the building, the water rights, and the land outright. No liens, no debts, no partners except the town itself. A small pause. I'm rather proud of that, actually. You should be, he said. It came out without any of the social decoration that might have made it a mere pleasantry, and she heard that, and something in her gray eyes softened fractionally before she looked back at her bowl. What about you? She asked. What have you been doing, Jeremiah Chandler, for 4 years? He gave her the honest version, which was not particularly flattering. He had drifted. He had taken work with the railroad, with cattle outfits, with a surveying company for a few months. He had tried his hand at a small ranch in the Oklahoma Territory with a partner who turned out to be better at drinking than ranching, and that enterprise had ended quietly and without drama, but also without profit. He was, by his own frank accounting, a man who had spent 4 years being moderately good at a number of things and excellent at none. She listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. When he finished, she said, "What are you good at? Really good at?" He thought about it. "Knowing land," he said. "I can read land the way some men read a map. I know water and drainage and soil and where things will grow. I've just never had the money to do anything serious with that knowledge." She said, in the way that means something is being considered rather than dismissed. After supper she made coffee, real coffee from beans ground that morning, and they sat at the table longer than the meal required and talked. He was surprised by how easily it came, the talking. He had remembered her as quiet, as restrained, as a woman battening herself down against a storm. But she was not quiet now. She was precise and dry, and occasionally very funny in a way she seemed almost not to notice, as if the humor were simply part of the texture of how she saw the world. She asked about the cattle trade, and he explained it in detail she seemed genuinely interested in. She told him about the politics of the town, about the merchant named Asab Briggs who had tried twice to get the county to revoke her water rights on grounds she still considered spurious, and about the judge who had ruled against Briggs both times and seemed to rather enjoy doing so. "Briggs doesn't like you," he observed. "Briggs doesn't like that a woman built something before he thought to build it himself," she said. "He had the capital and the connections, and he sat on them while I was hauling timber." She did not say it with anger, only with the mild impatience of a person who has had to navigate something tedious too many times. "He'll come around eventually. People always do, once the numbers are too obvious to argue with." He left at 9 o'clock, because it was proper and because she had made no indication she wished him to stay, and she walked him to the green door and stood in the doorway while he went down the porch steps into the cool Colorado night. "Your favor," she said when he was at the gate. "I still haven't paid it." He turned back. "Maybe I'll think of something," he said. She looked at him from the doorway, the lamp behind her making a warm halo around the outline of her. "Stay a few days," she said. "Look around, see if there's something here worth staying for." He was not entirely certain whether she was talking about the town. He stayed, not because of the town, though the town was good, not because the hotel bed was comfortable, though it was better than most. He stayed because he woke the next morning and found that the 40-mile-an-hour restlessness that had been driving him east to west and north to south for 4 years had gone quiet overnight. And in the quiet he discovered he was not yet ready to pick it back up. He spent the first full day walking the town and its surroundings, because he was a man who learned a place by walking it. He went up along the creek bed north of the mill and then turned east and climbed the first ridge, coming out above the timber line into a meadow of brown spring grass with patches of old snow in the shadows of the pines. He stood there for a long time looking down at the valley and at the town with its copper bell catching the morning light, and he thought about what she had said about Cassidy Creek needing the things that make a place permanent. He could see, with the eye he had for land, that there were things missing. The valley floor had good soil in the lower reaches near the creek, soil that would grow more than hay. There was a stretch of southeast-facing slope below the ridge that looked to him like apple country. He had seen that same exposure and that same dark, slightly rocky soil in Missouri orchards that produced more fruit than the markets could absorb. He had noted the night before at supper that the only fruit Catherine served was dried, shipped in from the lower elevations, expensive by local standards. On the second day, he went to see the mill again, this time in a professional capacity. He asked her to walk him through the operation, which she did with the focused clarity of a person who understood every component and why it existed. He had enough knowledge of millwork from his surveying days to ask intelligent questions, and she answered them with a precision that told him she had thought through everything he asked before he asked it. He noticed, watching her talk, that she used her hands when she spoke about the mill the way she did not use them in ordinary conversation. When she was describing the mechanism or explaining a problem she had solved, her hands moved with the ideas, drawing invisible diagrams in the air. It was the most unguarded he had seen her, and he found he wanted to keep asking questions just to watch it. In the afternoon, she showed him around the rest of the town with a proprietorial familiarity that made several people smile in a way that suggested they were noting it. She introduced him simply as Jeremiah Chandler, a friend from Kansas, which felt both accurate and incomplete in a way he suspected she knew perfectly well. The merchant Asab Briggs saw them from across the street, and his expression cycled through several things before settling on a studied neutrality that fooled neither of them. "He's watching us," Jeremiah said, without turning his head. "He's always watching something," Catherine said tranquilly. "It's how he compensates for not doing things." On the third evening she invited him to supper again without making it seem like an invitation, simply mentioning as they walked back toward the mill that she was making roast chicken, and that it was a great deal of chicken for one person. He said he would come at 6. She said 5 was fine, actually, if he wanted to come early and help with the garden. She had been meaning to get the first planting in, and 2 pairs of hands were better than 1. He had not planted a kitchen garden since he was a boy, but it turned out that the knowledge came back in the same way that swimming does, the hands remembering what the mind had set aside. They worked in the garden in the cool late afternoon, with the mountains going pink around them and the creek audible from where they worked, and it was the most completely at ease he had felt in longer than he could account for. She told him about Thomas, her brother, who had married and had 2 children, and wrote her letters from Cincinnati that she answered faithfully, but that made her feel the distance between them in a way she could not quite resolve. She was glad he was settled and glad he was well and she loved him, but she did not wish she were there. "Do you get lonely?" he asked. She pressed a row of seed potatoes into the dark earth with her thumb, one after another, methodical. "Sometimes," she said, "more in the winter when the work slows and the town closes in on itself, but lonely and alone are different things. I've spent enough time not being alone without being anything but lonely that I can tell the difference." He understood exactly what she meant. "Yes," he said. She glanced over at him. "You too, I expect." "For most of 4 years," he said. They were quiet after that in the way that 2 people are quiet when something true has been acknowledged and does not need to be elaborated. At supper she said, over the chicken and potatoes, "What is it you're thinking of doing? About staying or going?" He set his fork down. "What I'd like to do," he said, "and what makes practical sense are 2 different things." "Tell me the first one," she said. He looked at her across the white crockery and the lamplight and the particular quality of courage that she had, which was not the loud kind but the daily, relentless kind, and he said, "What I'd like to do is find a piece of land in this valley and make something of it. There's a southeast slope about 3 miles northeast of town that would grow apples, good ones. This valley doesn't have an orchard and it should." She was very still. "An orchard," she said. "Apple orchards take 7 years to produce a full crop," he said. "It's a long investment. It's not for a man who's planning to be somewhere else in 2 years." "No," she agreed quietly. "It isn't. The land I'm thinking of is creek adjacent on the lower portion," he continued, because he had thought it through with some precision and the thinking helped him say the rest. "It would need a house, a small one to start." "A house," she said. "And some help, very likely, getting the first year's planting in order. I know land, but I've never run an orchard. There would be things I'd need to learn." "There's a man in Gunnison who kept an orchard for 20 years, she said, and her voice was very careful and perfectly level. "He comes through twice a year to trade. He might be persuaded to advise." "That would be useful," Jeremiah said. They looked at each other. "You're talking about staying," she said. "I'm talking about staying," he confirmed. "Because of the land," she said. He picked his fork back up. "Partly," he said. She looked down at her plate and he thought he saw, very briefly, the corner of her mouth do something. When she looked up again she was entirely composed. "There's a property sale next month," she said. "The northeast tract has been unclaimed since the Whitmore family left last autumn. You want to look at it before anyone else does." "I'd appreciate knowing which land office handles it," he said. "Hector Malley," she said. "He's honest and he's slow, but he's honest. I can introduce you." "I'd appreciate that too," he said. That night, walking home in the dark along the unpaved street with the stars very large overhead, Jeremiah Chandler permitted himself a degree of happiness that he had not allowed in some time on the grounds that it had never seemed warranted. He was careful about it, the way you are careful with something you are not sure yet how to carry. But it was there, unmistakable and warm, and he carried it the 3 blocks to the hotel with a care that would have looked, to anyone watching, like a very slight smile. He stayed another week, which became 2. He arranged a meeting with Hector Malley, who was indeed slow and indeed honest. He spent several hours walking the northeast tract with an old farmer named Ira Sutherland, who had been in the valley since 1877, and knew the soil and the frost lines, and the particular character of the creek water in each season. Ira chewed tobacco thoughtfully and listened to Jeremiah's ideas about the orchard and said, after a long pause, "Might work, might not. Only one way to know," which Jeremiah took as endorsement. He visited Catherine at the mill most mornings on the pretext of questions about the town or the land, and she answered his questions and occasionally asked her own. They fell into a pattern of taking their midday meal together at the small cafe run by a Mexican woman named Senora Vega, who made the best red chili stew Jeremiah had tasted anywhere in the territory. They sat at the corner table by the window and talked through the meal and sometimes beyond it, and it felt natural enough that neither of them commented on how natural it felt, which was itself a kind of comment. He noticed things about her in those 2 weeks. She remembered names with extraordinary precision, every farmer's wife, every child's ailment, every rancher's specific grain requirement. She was fair to the point of stubbornness in her business dealings, refusing twice in his hearing to take an advantage she might easily have taken, because the other party would have been hurt by it. She read every evening after supper by the window with a lamp. She could be silent for long stretches without discomfort, and this had the effect of making her words, when they came, carry more weight. She had a deep, genuine laugh that she deployed sparingly and which transformed her face completely when it appeared. And she was afraid of him, not in any way that showed, not in any way she would have admitted or perhaps even acknowledged. But he had developed, over years of paying attention in places where inattention was dangerous, a fine-grained sensitivity to what people were trying not to show, and what Catherine Rourke was trying not to show was that he was reaching her, and that she was not entirely sure what to do about it. He understood it. He was afraid of the same thing for the same reason, which was simply that it mattered, and things that matter are the ones that cost you when they go wrong. 3 weeks after his arrival, he made an offer on the Northeast Tract, and Hector Malloy, proceeding at his characteristic pace, accepted it within the week. The price was fair. Jeremiah paid a quarter of it in cash from the savings he had built carefully over 4 years of solitary living with few expenses, and arranged the remainder in a payment structure that Mal wrote out with his slow and meticulous hand. He was now, for the first time in his adult life, the owner of land. He stood on his land the evening after the papers were signed and watched the last of the light leave the mountain peaks, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for as long as he could remember. It was not a dramatic feeling. It was quiet and deep and quite certain. He had not been to see Catherine that day, because the business with Mal had taken the morning and the afternoon, and by the time it was done the mill was closed and the day was late. He thought about going to the house on the hill, but he wanted to tell her about the land in the right way, not at the door on an impulse but properly. He went back to the hotel, sat down, and wrote her a note that said simply, "The land is mine. I thought you should know." JC he gave it to Mrs. Haverson's boy to deliver, and the next morning when he came to the mill Catherine was already outside waiting. She had her arms crossed against the morning cool, and her gray eyes were bright in a way that suggested she had not entirely managed to compose them before he arrived. "Congratulations," she said. "Thank you," he said. They stood in the morning light beside the creek that ran quick and cold and bright below them. "I'll need help," he said. "Getting started. I don't have any illusion about what I don't know." "Everyone needs help," she said. "The ones who don't admit it are the ones who fail." She paused. "I can help where I can." "I know," he said, and then, "Catherine," she looked at him. "I came here because of a favor," he said. "That's what I told myself, but I think you knew from the first evening that it was not primarily about a favor." She was quiet for a long moment. The creek ran. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the willows along the bank. "I thought it might not be," she said finally, with a care that was different from her usual precision, softer at the edges. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly. With your full knowledge of what I have and what I don't, which is a piece of land with nothing on it and a plan that will take 7 years to show its full results. I'm telling you directly because you seem like a woman who prefers directness." "I am," she said. "What do you think?" he asked. She looked out at the creek for a moment and then back at him. "I think," she said slowly, that a man who reads land the way you describe and has the patience for a 7-year plan is not the kind of man who leaves without reason. I've had enough of men who leave. Something moved across her face briefly. My father, Thomas, eventually. Men who meant well and went anyway. I bought land, he said. Land is not a temporary arrangement. No, she agreed. It is not. She unfolded her arms. Court me then, and we'll see what we see. What they saw over the following months was considerable. He began building on the northeast tract at the start of May, starting with a small house of 2 rooms that he framed and raised with the help of Ira Sutherland and 2 of the men from the mill, whom Catherine had offered on their off days, and for whom he paid a fair wage and the best lunch he could manage. The house was modest but sound, with a real stone fireplace and windows that faced south and east to catch the light. He was proud of the windows. He had put them in himself, and they were plumb. He began preparing the orchard site in early summer, terracing the slope with a technique Ira had seen used successfully in an orchard he knew in Utah. Small level-cut benches, running with the contour of the hill that would hold moisture and prevent the steep runoff that would otherwise pull his young trees' roots loose in a hard rain. It was exhausting and painstaking work, and he did most of it himself, spending his days on the slope with a pick and a shovel and a line level, and his evenings at Catherine's table or walking along the creek in the long summer twilight that came late and left reluctantly in that high valley. They talked during those walks about everything and nothing with the ease of 2 people who have both been solitary and have discovered, with some surprise, that company can be a relief rather than an obligation. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father's farm that had been lost in the aftermath of the war, about the years of wandering that had followed. She told him about the years before Colorado, about the mother who had died when she was 16, leaving her to manage a household for a father who was kind, but increasingly absent in the way that grief makes a person absent. About Thomas, who had been her closest friend and her greatest worry, and about the night on the Cimarron Road that had been in the strangest way the beginning of everything. If your brother hadn't been shot, he said one evening as they sat on the bank of the creek with the mountains going dark blue around them, we'd never have met. I've thought about that, she said. The things that have to go wrong for the right thing to happen. It seems wasteful as a system. But here we are anyway, he said. Here we are anyway, she agreed. He kissed her for the first time in late June, on the evening after the frame of the house was finished, when they were standing on the porch of the new house in the low gold light of a summer evening looking out at the terrace slope of the orchard site. He had not planned it, or rather he had been planning it for weeks in the indirect way that he did most things, circling the intention without committing to it. And then she had said something about the light on the mountains and turned to look at him, and he had simply run out of reasons not to. She was very still for a moment afterward, looking at him with those gray eyes that he was beginning to be able to read more accurately now, and what they said was that she was not surprised and that she was not sorry, and then she took a quiet breath and looked back at the mountains. I've been waiting for you to do that for 3 months, she said. I was working up to it, he said. You take your time, she said. So do you, he said, about most things. She glanced at him. Most things worth doing take time, she said, which was, he understood, a statement about more than the kiss. The summer unfolded with the deep, particular quality of a summer that contains something you know you will remember. He planted the first of the young apple trees in August, ordering them from a nursery in Fort Collins that Senora Vega had mentioned in passing, and that turned out to stock excellent root stock from 2 established Colorado orchards. He spent 3 full days setting the young trees in their terraced rows, spacing them according to the measurements he had worked out with the help of a correspondence he had established with a pomologist in Denver, who had responded to his written inquiries with surprising warmth and a great deal of useful information. The trees were small, barely more than sticks with roots, and they required daily attention in the hot, dry weeks of August. He carried water from the creek in the early morning before the heat peaked, a system he had built using a series of troughs and dividers that Ira Sutherland had told him was essentially the same method the Pueblo people had used on their crops centuries before, and which the land itself seemed to validate by taking the water readily. He watched the trees with the focused, attentive care of a man watching something he has committed to, and when the first few put out new leaves in early September and he was certain they were taking hold, he felt a satisfaction so pure it was almost difficult to bear. Catherine came out to see the trees on a Sunday afternoon in September. She walked the rows carefully, touching the small stakes he had driven beside each sapling, reading the small labels he had written in his neat hand, noting the variety of each. She was quiet for a long while. "Baldwin Roxbury Russet Northern Spy," she said, reading the labels. "You've been studying." "For months," he said. She reached the end of the last row and turned back to look at the slope, at the young trees in their terraced lines, at the house visible at the lower end of the property with its south-facing windows catching the afternoon light. Her expression was complicated in a way he had learned to simply sit with rather than try to resolve. "This is real," she said, which was not a question. "It's real," he said. She turned to look at him. "You're staying," she said. "I've told you that." "Yes," she said. "But seeing it is different from being told." She looked back at the orchard. "I built the mill and people told me they believed in it and I appreciated that, but when it actually ground its first grain and I saw the flower and I knew it was real, that was different. That was knowing." He understood exactly what she meant. "This is the same," he said. "This is knowing." She nodded once slowly, and then she looked at him with the gray eyes that he could read clearly now, and what they said was something she had not said in words yet, something that was waiting for its own moment, its own kind of knowing. The autumn came in with gold and copper and the smell of wood smoke and cold creek water. The town of Cassidy Creek put up its first proper Christmas decorations in November, an indication, the newspaper editor wrote, of a community that was settling into itself. Asab Briggs, who had been watching Jeremiah's activities with the same studied neutrality he'd applied to Catherine, came into the mill one morning in October and offered Catherine a business proposition involving shared grain storage. She came to dinner that evening with bright eyes and told Jeremiah that Briggs had been so thoroughly businesslike about it that she suspected someone had advised him to let it go. "Progress," Jeremiah said. "Progress," she agreed, raising her coffee cup slightly in a small, private toast. He had been in Cassidy Creek for 6 months when the question of what came next between them became, by the logic of proximity and honesty, and the particular intimacy that had been building in the slow, patient way that things worth building take, unavoidable. It was November, a cold, clear evening with a full moon whitening the valley, and they were at Catherine's table after supper, the dishes cleared, the lamp lit, a fire in the stove making the kitchen warm against the Colorado night. She was reading, and he was looking at a rough plan he had been making for the spring's work, and there was such a deep domesticity to the moment that he became abruptly and entirely conscious of it. He set the plan down. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked up from her book. He had thought about how to say it. He had thought about it for several weeks with the same methodical attention he brought to the orchard planning, and he had concluded, as he usually concluded with Catherine, that the direct way was the right way. "I want to marry you," he said. "I am asking you to be my wife. I know the house is small and the orchard won't produce a full crop for years, and I'm not a man of any great means at this moment. But I'm a man who's not going anywhere, and I think that counts for something." She was very still. The fire made small sounds in the stove. Outside, the creek ran below the ice that was beginning to form at its edges. "It counts for a great deal," she said quietly. "Is that a yes?" he asked. She set her book down with the deliberate care she brought to most things, and she looked at him across the lamplight, and her gray eyes were clear and certain and something that he had no word for except simply right. "Yes," she said. "It is." He reached across the table and she gave him her hand and he held it for a moment in both of his, which was not an elegant gesture but was an entirely sincere one, and she looked at their hands and then at him, and then she laughed, that rare, transforming laugh that came from somewhere deep, and said, "I have been waiting for months for you to ask." "I was working up to it," he said. "You always are," she said. They were married on the 14th of December, 1882, in the small church with the copper bell, by the Reverend Miles, who was a compact, energetic man of 50 who seemed genuinely delighted by the ceremony and preached a mercifully short sermon on the subject of covenant that managed to be both theologically sound and entirely personal. The whole town came. This did not particularly surprise Jeremiah, who had come to understand that Catherine Rourke was, in Cassidy Creek, something like a civic institution, but it moved him nonetheless, the way the church filled with people who were genuinely glad. Ira Sutherland sat in the third row and chewed the inside of his cheek in what turned out to be his expression of deep satisfaction. Senora Vega brought a cake to the reception afterward that was the finest thing Jeremiah had eaten in his life, and possibly in anyone else's. Hector Mal arrived late, as expected, but was present for the vows, which was the important part. Even Asa Briggs came, and shook Jeremiah's hand with a firm grip, and told Catherine that she had made a sensible choice, which she received with a serene thank you that suggested she had already known what his opinion would be and had not required it. The three workers from the mill had clubbed together and bought a pair of good wool blankets that were folded in brown paper on the porch of the house when they came home that night. The house was warm. The fire Ira had laid in the fireplace before the ceremony caught quickly when Jeremiah lit it, and the south-facing windows held the blue of the December night sky until the lamps inside made them bright and reflective, and they became mirrors of the room of the fire, of the two of them standing in the center of the life they had built. Catherine stood in the middle of the front room in her gray wedding dress, the one she had made herself from a bolt of fine wool brought up from Denver, and looked around at the house, her expression the quiet one she wore when something had resolved itself satisfactorily. "It's a good house," she said. "It'll be a better one," he said, "given time." She looked at him with the gray eyes, warm now, unguarded in a way they so rarely were in company. "Given time," she agreed, and she crossed the room to where he was standing, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in front of the fire for a while without talking, which was its own kind of conversation. The winter was long and cold and beautiful in the way that Colorado winters are, fierce and pure and blue, with snow that came in deep and stayed, and made the valley into something muffled and still. They were snowbound for a week in January, and he discovered that Catherine in enforced stillness was a different creature than Catherine in motion, equally herself but turned inward, reading, thinking, occasionally talking with a reflective openness that the busy seasons did not always allow. They played chess in the evenings, which she was better at than he was and would not pretend otherwise, and they read aloud to each other from the books on the shelf by the fireplace. And on the weekends when the weather eased, he helped her carry what was needed for the mill's operations through the deep snow, while she managed the books that did not stop their arithmetic just because the ground was frozen. He had never spent a winter in close company with anyone and found, to his continuing surprise, that far from eroding anything between them, the closeness deepened it. He learned the particular quality of her silences, which were many and which he stopped trying to fill. She learned the way he approached problems, which was to circle them in silence for a while before he spoke, and she stopped interpreting this as reluctance. Spring came back to the valley in March with mud and snowmelt, and the first tentative green of returning grass along the creek banks. He checked the orchard trees daily in late March, anxious about them in a way he recognized from his father's farm, the primal worry of a person whose hope is invested in things that grow. They were alive, all 43 of them, their bark tight and unbroken, their buds beginning to swell. He went back to the house and told Catherine, who set down the ledger she was reviewing and looked at him with quiet delight. "All 43, she said. "All 43, he confirmed. "Then they'll survive," she said. "The first winter is the hardest. If they've gotten through it, they know how to be here." He thought that was a remarkable thing to say about apple trees and also possibly about people. In April, Catherine told him she was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning while he was making coffee, which meant that the most forgettable day of the week had now distinguished itself twice in the course of his life, with things of enormous consequence. He turned around from the stove and looked at her, and she looked back at him with the expression she wore when she had checked something from every angle and was certain of it. He set the coffee pot down, crossed the kitchen, and put his arms around her and held on for a longer moment than was perhaps entirely composed, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he felt her exhale a breath she had perhaps been holding since she found out. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Somewhat," she said. "Are you?" "Somewhat," he said, "but somewhat is fine, somewhat is manageable." "Yes," she said, "it is." The spring and summer of 1883 moved through the valley in the patient way that consequential things move, neither rushing toward their completion nor dwelling overlong on any single moment, but proceeding with the sureness of something that knows where it is going. The orchard trees put out new growth with an enthusiasm that surprised even Jeremiah, who had been optimistic. The mill added its second stone in June, which doubled its capacity as Catherine had planned, and Jeremiah spent several Sundays helping to install the new mechanism, discovering that his mechanical intuition, applied to millwork, was more useful than he had expected. Catherine received the fruit of this contribution with the gracious practicality of a woman who is not surprised to find her husband competent, but is nonetheless pleased by it. The child arrived in November, on the 3rd, which was a clear, cold day with a pale blue sky and a dusting of fresh snow on the mountain peaks above the valley. He was a boy. He was large and vocal and deeply unimpressed by his circumstances, which Jeremiah found endearing. They named him Daniel, after Catherine's grandfather, who had been a steady and reliable man, and James, after Jeremiah's own father, because it seemed right. Daniel James Chandler arrived in the world with black hair and gray eyes that combined his parents' features in a way that struck everyone who saw him as immediately obvious and entirely right. Catherine held him in the first hour with the same expression she wore in the mill when she saw the grain ground fine and white, and knew the work had gone well, the deep, satisfying recognition of a thing accomplished. Jeremiah sat beside the bed in the small house that was becoming less small by necessity, and looked at his wife and his son, and felt the thing he had no good word for, that fullness that has no bottom, and he thought about the telegram on the corner table in Abilene, and the favor he had supposedly ridden 2 weeks to collect, and the sign above the mill door that had stopped him where he stood, and he thought that whatever he had imagined collecting, nothing in his accounting could have arrived at this. Life in Cassidy Creek in the years that followed had the quality of something being built from good materials by people who knew what they were doing. The orchard moved through its slow, patient years, each spring adding new growth, the trees filling out from sticks to saplings to proper young apple trees that in their 5th year put out their first tentative crop. Not much, a few dozen apples per tree, but real, honest, sweet Colorado apples that Catherine sliced at the kitchen table and distributed without ceremony to the mill workers and to Ira Sutherland, who took a bite and chewed slowly and said, "Not bad," which they both knew was as close to enthusiastic as Ira came. Jeremiah expanded the orchard in 1885, adding 2 new rows of pear trees on the advice of the Denver pomologist, with whom he had maintained a correspondence that had become something like a friendship. He also, that year, began offering his land-reading skills to the surrounding farms and ranches on a formal basis, helping neighbors assess drainage problems and find good well site locations. He charged modestly and was paid consistently, and the work gave him a presence in the county that complemented Catherine's without competing with it. In 1885, Catherine also hired a young woman named Margaret Tilson to help manage the mill's accounts, freeing herself to spend more time on the expansion she had been planning for 2 years. The expanded mill now served almost 60 farms and ranches and was as central to the valley's economy as the bank. The Cassidy Creek Herald ran a story on Catherine in the spring of 1885 that described her as one of the territory's most successful independent business operators, a designation that pleased her less, she told Jeremiah, than the more concrete fact that she had paid her last debt installment, and the mill was now entirely free of any financial obligation. "Solvent and free," he said. "Solvent and free," she confirmed, with a satisfaction that was deep and entirely deserved. Daniel grew from a vocal infant into a curious and determined small boy who treated the orchard as a personal kingdom and the mill as a source of inexhaustible fascination. He had his mother's gray eyes and her precision, and his father's way of going quiet when he was thinking hard, which he did often. By the age of 3, he was following Jeremiah through the orchard with a focused solemnity that made the trees seem to be listening, and by 4, he could identify every variety by sight and tell you which needed more water and which were showing signs of the early blight that Jeremiah had learned to catch in its first stages. Catherine watched this with a warm and quiet delight that she expressed, characteristically, not in sentiment but in action. She began teaching Daniel to read using the books from the shelf by the fireplace with a methodical approach that had him reading simple sentences before his 5th birthday and whole passages by his 6th. Jeremiah taught him the land. Catherine taught him the ledger. Together they were raising someone who would understand both. In 1886, the orchard produced its first full crop. It was the 7th year since planting, exactly as the books had said, and the trees delivered on their promise with a generosity that was almost overwhelming. The Baldwin apples came first, red gold and heavy. The Northern Spy followed, tart and firm, and the Roxbury russets last, their rough brown skins concealing a honey sweetness that stopped people mid-bite. Jeremiah hired 2 men from town to help with the harvest, and Catherine came out on the first day of picking with Daniel on her hip and watched the trees give up their fruit with the expression of a person witnessing a long-kept promise fulfilled. He came to stand beside her. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he said. And now this, she said. And now this, he agreed. She leaned against his shoulder, which she did not often do in public but which she did now without apparent awareness of the concession to feeling, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the orchard, while the pickers moved through the trees with their baskets, and the air smelled of ripe apple and pine, and the particular sharpness of Colorado autumn. He brought the first load of apples to the mill as an experiment to see what could be pressed and stored, and the result was a cider of striking quality that Senora Vega, now operating a small restaurant adjacent to her original kitchen space, immediately wanted in quantity. By the second harvest, he had built a proper press from plans he had worked out with Ira Sutherland's grandson, a young man with a gift for carpentry, and the Chandler Orchard cider became, within 2 years, something of a regional commodity known as far as Gunnison and Durango. The mill and the orchard were not separately prosperous things, but a part of the same conversation between 2 people who had built well. Catherine expanded the mill's storage twice more in the late 80s. Jeremiah added a second orchard block of half an acre in 1888. They hired steadily, adding to the employment of the valley in small but consistent increments that the town noticed and appreciated. Asab Briggs, who had been watching all of this from his merchant's window for years, finally came around completely in 1887, when he invested in a grain elevator on the edge of town and approached Catherine to discuss how their operations might support each other rather than compete. The meeting lasted 3 hours and ended with a handshake that both parties seemed genuinely satisfied with. Catherine reported to Jeremiah that evening that Briggs had said she had built the most sensible business in the valley, which she received as the compliment it was clearly intended to be, and which she appreciated more than she would have predicted, coming from him. The house grew with them. In 1886, Jeremiah added 2 rooms on the north side with the help of 3 neighbors who donated their labor in return for apple cider, and the assurance of a community goodwill that operated on no formal ledger, but was felt by everyone. The south-facing windows remained, now giving onto a porch he had built along the front of the house in 1884, wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table, and the kind of evening conversations that require a view of the valley below. They sat on that porch in the evenings when the weather allowed and watched the light leave the mountains and the stars come out above the pines, and Catherine read or sewed and Jeremiah planned or simply sat, and Daniel played in the grass below the porch steps until the light was too gone to play by, and it was, in the most ordinary and profound sense, a life, a complete one, the kind that does not leave itself unfinished. In the spring of 1888, Catherine told him she was expecting again, in the same kitchen, with the same coffee being made, and he turned around and looked at her with the same expression he had worn the first time, which she pointed out was notable. "What expression?" He said. "The one where you forget you're holding something," she said, looking at the coffee pot he had set down without noticing. He laughed. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, and she said against his shoulder, "I hope it's a girl this time. Daniel needs a sibling who will argue with him." "Daniel argues plenty on his own," Jeremiah said. "He gets that from someone," she said. In October of 1888, on the 9th, which was a warm day for autumn with a breeze coming off the mountains carrying the last of the season's warmth, their daughter arrived. She was smaller than Daniel had been and immediately more interested in the proceedings, looking around with an alert dark gaze from her first minutes in the world. They named her Rose, for the rose bush beside the porch steps that had now weathered 9 Colorado winters and was, against all reasonable expectation, still producing flowers every June. Rose Chandler grew into exactly the person her mother had requested, a child of decisive opinion and considerable argumentative skill, who could be overruled only with great effort and clear logic, and who accepted clear logic when presented with a good grace that made Jeremiah think the arguments were as much about the quality of the reasoning as the outcome. She followed her mother through the mill with the same concentrated attention that Daniel brought to the orchard, and by the age of 6, she could tell you to the bushel what the current inventory was and why it mattered. Daniel, who had initially greeted his sister's arrival with the mild suspicion of a firstborn, became within a year her staunchest defender and most loyal companion, a fact that Catherine observed with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose prediction had been exactly right. The year 1889 brought Colorado to statehood, which it had already held since 1876, but which the surrounding territories' changes seemed to make feel new again, the sense of the region settling permanently into itself. Cassidy Creek was by then a proper and established town with 2 doctors, a proper hotel that had replaced the modest establishment where Jeremiah had first stayed, a school with 2 teachers, and a population that counted itself as stable and intending to stay. The Herald ran an editorial that year about the growth of the valley's agricultural economy, and cited the Chandler Orchard and Rourke Mill, specifically as examples of the kind of enterprise that had given the region its economic foundation, the mill providing essential processing for the grain crops that had replaced silver as the valley's primary industry, the orchard demonstrating that the land could produce beyond the expected. Jeremiah read this aloud at breakfast, and Catherine listened with her eyes on her coffee cup, and when he finished she said, "It's a little excessive." "It's accurate," he said. "Accuracy and excess are not mutually exclusive," she said, but the corner of her mouth was doing the thing it did when she was pleased. Jeremiah had by 1889 become something more than a man with an orchard. He had become the person people in the valley came to when they needed land assessed, when they had drainage problems or soil questions or disputed boundaries that required someone who could read the ground rather than just the map. He had no formal title for it. He charged what seemed fair, and sometimes not even that. But he was known and trusted in the county in a way that was entirely separate from his wife's reputation and entirely complementary to it. He was 34 years old and had more peace than he had ever expected to find, and found, in that peace, more energy than the restlessness of his 20s had ever produced. The stillness of being settled did not quiet him. It focused him, the way still water reflects more clearly than moving water. He thought about this on a morning in the autumn of 1889, standing in the orchard with Daniel beside him, while they assessed the trees for the harvest that was coming. The valley spread below them in its autumn colors, gold and red and the dark green of the pines, and the town was visible at the southern end with the copper bell of the church catching the morning light in its familiar way. The mill was there, down at the bend of the creek, the sign visible from the orchard slope if you knew where to look. The white house with its green door was there below them, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin straight line in the still morning air. Daniel said seriously, looking at one of the Baldwin trees, "This one needs more water next year. The leaves went early on the left side." Jeremiah looked at the tree. He was entirely right. "Good eye," he said. Daniel accepted this with the mild satisfaction of someone who knew he was right and found confirmation agreeable but not necessary. He was very much his mother's son, in that respect. They finished the orchard walk and came down the slope to the house, where Catherine was on the porch with Rose, who was working with intense concentration at a small wooden puzzle that Senora Vega had given her. Catherine looked up when they came through the gate and looked at Jeremiah the way she had learned to look at him, openly and without the defensive caution that had governed that gray gaze in the beginning. He looked back at her the same way. "Well," she said. "Good crop," he said. "Chandler says the left Baldwin needs more water." He tilted his head toward Daniel, who was already climbing the porch steps to look at what Rose was doing. Catherine's mouth curved. "Chandler," she said. "I like that." A pause. "You're proud of him." "Every day," he said. He came up the porch steps and sat in the other chair, and she poured him a cup of coffee from the pot she had brought out, which was warm and slightly bitter and exactly right. Rose abandoned the puzzle to climb into his lap with the supreme confidence of a child who has never doubted her welcome, and he settled her against his chest, and she immediately pointed at the puzzle and began explaining the problem with it in a detailed and serious way that indicated she wanted assistance. He helped with the puzzle. Catherine read. Daniel sat on the porch railing and looked out at the valley with the expression of a person already planning what came next. The morning light fell over all of them in that generous Colorado way, warm and wide, and the creek ran below the house in its bright, continuous voice, and the orchard stood on its terrace slope above them with its rows of strong, producing trees, and the town was there, the copper bell quiet in the morning, the mill sound, the roads clear. A favor had been owed. A man had ridden 2 weeks to collect it, and had found, instead of what he imagined, something so far beyond what he had imagined that the two things could not reasonably be compared. He had found Catherine Rourke, who had made something extraordinary of herself in a valley between 2 ridges of pine mountains, who ran a mill that fed half the county and kept her books with a precision that made Hector Malloy, on the one occasion he had reviewed them, visibly emotional, who grew roses in the Colorado wind and read by lamplight in the evenings, and argued with Asab Briggs and won, and laughed that rare, transforming laugh when something genuinely delighted her, which happened more often now than it had when she was fighting for every inch of what she had built. He had found her, and finding her had found himself, and everything that had seemed unfinished in the long, restless years before Colorado had finished itself here, quietly, and with the thoroughness of something that was always intended. The note was still in his vest pocket. The IOU pressed between the pages of the almanac on the shelf beside the fireplace. He had never formally collected the favor, and she had never formally paid it, and they had both, by unspoken agreement, decided that this was exactly right. Some debts, when you look at what they have compounded into, are better left to stand. In the years that followed, the orchard grew to 3 full blocks, and the cider gained enough of a reputation that Jeremiah received an inquiry from a buyer in Denver, which he and Catherine discussed over 2 evenings before deciding to supply a modest quantity while keeping the primary business local, because local was what they had built for and local was where they intended to stay. The mill went on serving the valley, and Catherine added, in 1891, a small storage and sorting facility adjacent to the main building that allowed her to handle seed grain as well as flour, a logical extension that expanded her service to the farming community in ways that proved, within a year, to have been entirely the right decision. Daniel, at 12, was old enough to take on real work in the orchard, which he did with a seriousness that made Ira Sutherland, who had become something of a grandfather figure to him, say with his characteristic compression that the boy had a gift. Ira died in the winter of 1892, at an age he had never bothered to pin down precisely, in his bed in the small house on the edge of town, peacefully, and with the quiet dignity of a man who had done what he set out to do and was satisfied. Jeremiah carried one corner of his coffin and felt the weight of it as something beyond the physical, the weight of a person who had given him good advice at the start of things and had lived to see the results. They buried Ira in the churchyard below the Copper Bell, and the Reverend Miles, older now and slower but no less energetic in his convictions, said the words over him with genuine warmth, and Catherine stood beside Jeremiah in the cold February air and slipped her hand into his without looking away from the proceedings, and he held it. Rose, at 4 years old, asked on the way home what happened when someone died, and Catherine answered her with a directness and a gentleness that Jeremiah stored away in the part of his memory where he kept things he wanted to keep perfectly. The children were good children. Not perfect, because they were real, but good, in the way that people who have been treated honestly tend to be good. There were hard years. In 1893, the silver crash that hit Colorado hard sent ripples even into Cassidy Creek, which had transitioned away from silver, but was not immune to the economic contraction that followed. 3 of Catherine's farming clients had difficult years and needed to defer payment for the mill's services, which she accommodated with a payment plan that was firm enough to be sustainable and flexible enough to be humane, and all 3 were current within 2 years. The orchard was not touched by the crash, because people needed apples regardless of silver prices, a simple fact that Jeremiah had not explicitly calculated when he planted, but which proved to be the case. In 1895, they celebrated 13 years in Cassidy Creek with a supper that Senora Vega prepared in her restaurant, and that included what felt like half the town. It was not a formal occasion, but it became one by the gathering's own momentum, people arriving who had heard there was a celebration at Vega's, neighbors and clients and friends accumulated over a decade, and more of being woven into the fabric of a place. Hector Mao, who was now quite old and had handed the land office to his son, made a small and slightly rambling toast that included a reference to a certain land sale in 1882 that had been, in his opinion, the best piece of business the valley had ever seen. Jeremiah and Catherine looked at each other across the table in the way that 2 people look at each other when there is a great deal to say and the setting is not quite right for saying it, and saved it for the walk home. The walk home that night was long and slow, the town quiet around them and the sky brilliant with stars in the way that a high Colorado valley in September can produce a sky that looks almost fabricated. Too many stars, too bright, too clear. The children were with Senora Vega's niece for the night, which gave the walk a quality of space that they used without urgency. 13 years, Catherine said. More than a third of your life, he said. The best third, she said without hesitation. Then, after a pause, the first 2/3 were necessary. They made the last third possible, but still. He put his arm around her as they walked. The creek was audible below them, running black and silver in the moonlight. The orchard was a dark mass on the slope above, the trees full and round in their maturity. "Are you happy?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was answering from the real place rather than the social one. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "More than I knew how to expect," he said. She leaned against him as they walked, which she did more easily now than she ever had. The guarded self-containment of those first months long since softened into something that was still Catherine, entirely Catherine, but Catherine with her hand open rather than closed. They came up the rise to the house, the green door visible in the moonlight, the rose bush beside the steps sending its last autumn fragrance out into the cold air. He opened the green door for her, and she went in and turned up the lamp, and the kitchen came alive in the warm light. The shelf of books, the braided rug, the white crockery on the table, all the accumulated details of a life assembled over time with care. He came in after her and closed the door against the September night. She was standing in the center of the kitchen looking at him with the gray eyes, clear and steady and warm. "I never paid the favor," she said. "No," he agreed. "What do you think it's worth?" she said. "After everything." He looked at her in the lamplight. In the kitchen of the house he had built on the land he had bought in the valley she had chosen, beside the orchard that had taken 7 years to produce, and the mill that had taken 14 months to raise from nothing, with the 2 children sleeping at Senora Vega's niece's house, and the star-filled Colorado sky outside the door, and all of it. Stemming from a Tuesday in Abilene and a 2-week ride on a gray horse named Duster and a sign above a mill door that had stopped him where he stood. "This," he said, "all of this, I'd call it paid." She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around his neck, and he put his around her waist, and they stood in the center of the room they had lived in for 13 years and were perfectly still. "Paid in full," she said, her face against his jaw. "Paid in full," he agreed and held on, and the lamp burned steady in the window, and outside the creek ran over its stones in the dark, and the orchard stood in its rows on the terrace slope, and the copper bell of the church was silent in the night waiting for morning, and Cassidy Creek went on being what it was, permanent and particular and real, the kind of place that holds what it is given and gives back more than it was meant to. It was enough. It was, without any qualification, exactly enough.